January 1945, the sky over Berlin. The air was thin and cold at 25,000 feet, where the winter sun cast long shadows across the fractured landscape below. German Oberleutnant Franz Stigler sat cramped in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, his breath condensing against the inside of his canopy as he scanned the horizon. The hum of his Daimler-Benz engine was a familiar companion, a mechanical heartbeat that had carried him through 3 years of aerial combat. He had trained to believe that the sky belonged to the Reich, that German engineering and Aryan discipline made them masters of this vertical battlefield. Below him, the smoking ruins of what had once been the industrial heart of Nazi Germany stretched toward every horizon. The thousand-year Reich was crumbling, but in the cockpit at altitude, there was still the illusion of control, of order, of supremacy. Then he saw them. At first, they were merely dark specks against the pale winter sky, growing larger as they approached from the west. Bomber formations. American B-17 flying fortresses, their silver bodies reflecting the weak sunlight as they droned eastward in tight defensive boxes. This was routine. Stigler had intercepted dozens of such formations. He knew the drill: attack from the sun, target the engines, avoid the gun turrets, exploit the gaps in their defensive fire. The Americans were predictable in their tactics, methodical in their formations. But as he closed the distance, banking his fighter into an attack position, something caught his eye that made him hesitate. The escort fighters. They flew in a protective screen around the bombers, their paint schemes unmistakable even from 2,000 meters away. Deep red tails, bright as arterial blood against the winter sky, red spinners on their propellers, red-painted vertical stabilizers that caught the light and seemed to glow with an almost defiant brilliance. North American P-51 Mustangs, the newest and most lethal American fighter in European skies. But it wasn't the aircraft that froze something in Stigler's trained instincts. It was what they represented, what he had been told could not exist. The red-tailed Mustangs moved with fluid precision, their formations tight but flexible, responding to threats with a coordination that spoke of exceptional training and combat experience. As one of them rolled to intercept his approach, the canopy glinted, and for just a moment Stigler saw the pilot's face. Dark skin, African features, an impossible sight, according to everything the Reich had taught him about the racial hierarchy that supposedly governed human capability and military competence. A black man, flying one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, defending American bombers over the heart of Germany. The moment of recognition cost him his advantage. The red-tailed Mustang accelerated with a burst of speed that the Messerschmitt couldn't match, closing the angle, forcing Stigler into a defensive break. His training took over, and he rolled hard right, diving toward the cloud deck below, his mind racing faster than his aircraft. In that instant of visual contact, something fundamental had cracked in the ideological armor he had worn for years. They had been told it was impossible. From the moment young German pilots entered the Luftwaffe training program, they were indoctrinated with the same racial theories that underpinned the entire Nazi state. The instructors at flight school spoke with absolute certainty. Africans and their descendants lacked the cognitive capacity for complex mechanical operation. They lacked the spatial reasoning required for three-dimensional combat. They lacked the discipline, the courage, the intelligence to master the demanding art of aerial warfare. These were not merely opinions, but presented as scientific facts, supported by pseudo-academic research, reinforced through years of propaganda. The Untermensch, the subhuman, could never achieve what the Aryan warrior could achieve. Japanese pilots had been fed similar ideologies from different sources. The divine superiority of the Yamato race, the Bushido code that supposedly elevated Japanese warriors above all others, the conviction that Western democracy bred weakness and that racial mixing in America created inferior soldiers. When Japanese aviators encountered American forces in the Pacific, They expected to face a disorganized rabble, soft from civilian comforts, lacking the spiritual purity necessary for true martial excellence. The idea that black Americans might fly fighters, might fly them well, was so far outside their conceptual framework that it simply didn't register as a possibility. But the red tails kept appearing. Over Austria, over Romania, over Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Wherever the American strategic bombing campaign struck deep into Axis territory, those crimson-marked Mustangs appeared, and with them came a level of fighter protection that began to shift the calculus of aerial combat over Europe. The bomber crews noticed it first. Formations escorted by the red-tailed fighters came home. Other groups, flying the same missions on the same days but escorted by different units, suffered devastating losses. The statistics began to tell a story that contradicted every assumption the Axis powers had made about race and military capability. The men flying those red-tailed Mustangs were the Tuskegee Airmen. Their story began not in the skies over Europe, but in the segregated American South, in a small Alabama town, where the United States Army Air Corps established an experimental training program in 1941. The word experimental carried weight. The program existed because First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt had pressured the War Department to prove, or disprove, whether black Americans could be trained as military pilots. The assumption within the military establishment was that the experiment would fail, that the evidence would justify continued segregation, that the status quo would be scientifically validated. The men who arrived at Tuskegee knew they carried more than their own ambitions. They carried the weight of collective judgment, the burden of proving human capacity against institutional prejudice. They came from colleges and technical schools, from families that had sacrificed everything to provide education in a country that systematically denied opportunities. They came with engineering degrees and mathematics backgrounds, with determination sharpened by years of navigating a society that told them daily what they supposedly could not achieve. The training was deliberately harder than standard flight school. Washout rates were higher. Standards were applied with unforgiving precision. If the program was going to succeed, if these pilots were going to reach combat, they would need to be undeniably, statistically, measurably better than average. Failure was not an individual matter. It was ammunition for those who wanted the program to fail entirely. So they flew in the Alabama heat, mastering aerobatics and instrument navigation, gunnery and formation tactics, pushing themselves and each other beyond the already demanding requirements, knowing that competence would not be enough. They would need to be exceptional, and they were. The 332nd Fighter Group deployed to Italy in early 1944. They inherited worn P-39 Airacobras first, then P-47 Thunderbolts, before finally receiving the aircraft that would become their signature. The P-51 Mustang, with its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and range that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The decision to paint their tails red was practical before it became symbolic. Fighter groups needed recognition markers so bomber crews could identify friendly escorts. Other units had yellow noses or checkered patterns. The 332nd chose red tails. The symbolism became powerful by accident of history. That bright red stood out against every background. Gray clouds, blue sky, industrial smoke. The color couldn't be missed, couldn't be mistaken. And very quickly, it couldn't be forgotten. Their first missions were routine patrols, familiarization flights, the standard introduction to combat theater operations. The skepticism from other units was tangible. White bomber crews openly questioned whether these pilots could be trusted with their lives. Some B-17 and B-24 crews requested different escorts. The institutional racism that permeated American society didn't stop at the military gate. But combat has a way of clarifying truth. Performance under fire burns away prejudice, or at least forces it underground in the face of undeniable evidence. The Tuskegee Airmen adopted tactics that prioritized bomber protection over individual glory. While other fighter groups sometimes broke formation to chase German fighters, racking up personal kill counts that would lead to ace status and medal recognition, the red-tailed pilots stuck close to their charges. They absorbed the fundamental mathematics of the strategic bombing campaign. Every bomber that reached its target and returned home was worth more than any single enemy fighter shot down. The mission was not personal achievement. The mission was getting those bombers through. German and Japanese intelligence officers began collecting reports. Interrogations of downed Luftwaffe pilots produced consistent descriptions. Red-tailed Mustangs that refused to be baited away from the bombers, aggressive but disciplined, skilled in deflection shooting, excellent in high-speed dives. The reports accumulated, and with them came a growing cognitive dissonance. These pilots performed at elite levels. They displayed tactical sophistication. They achieved kill ratios that matched or exceeded other American fighter groups, and they were black. For German pilots like Franz Stigler, the encounter created a fracture in worldview. He had been 15 years old when Hitler came to power, had absorbed the racial theories as unquestioned background truth, had built his identity as a Luftwaffe officer on the foundation of supposed Aryan superiority. Now, fleeing from a black pilot flying an American fighter that was faster, more agile, and better armed than his own aircraft, the cognitive dissonance became impossible to ignore. If the enemy was inferior, why was he diving for his life? If the racial science was correct, why were these red-tailed pilots consistently effective? The psychological impact went beyond individual encounters. The mere existence of the Tuskegee Airmen in combat contradicted the foundational mythology of Axis ideology. Both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had constructed elaborate intellectual scaffolding to justify their imperial ambitions, their conquests, their atrocities. The entire edifice rested on theories of racial hierarchy. The master race, the divine nation, the subhuman other. But here, in the most demanding technical and physical arena of modern warfare, high-altitude aerial combat, the supposedly inferior were demonstrating manifest equality, even excellence. Some German pilots responded with denial. They convinced themselves the reports were exaggerated, that the red-tailed fighters must be flown by white Americans in disguise, that the intelligence was propaganda. Others, like Stigler, found themselves unable to maintain the denial in the face of direct experience. The crack in ideology, once opened, began to widen. If they were wrong about this, what else might they be wrong about? Japanese pilots in the Pacific faced similar revelations when they encountered integrated American units, though their experiences came later and less systematically than the concentrated encounters in European skies. The mythology of Japanese racial superiority had been easier to maintain when the enemy seemed culturally distant and operationally incompetent. Early victories at Pearl Harbor and across Southeast Asia had confirmed the pre-war narrative. But as the war ground on, as American industrial capacity produced overwhelming material advantage, and as American units, including black servicemen in various roles, demonstrated tactical competence and fighting determination, the mythology began to hollow out. The Tuskegee Airmen flew their missions with a double burden. Every sortie was both a military operation and a referendum on human equality. They knew that their performance was being scrutinized not just by their commanders, but by a society that would use their successes or failures to justify continued segregation or begin dismantling it. The pressure was extraordinary. A white pilot who made a mistake was just a pilot who made a mistake. A black pilot who made a mistake was evidence that the entire race was unfit for combat aviation, so they flew with meticulous precision. They maintained their aircraft to standards that exceeded regulation. They briefed longer, debriefed more thoroughly, studied enemy tactics more intensively. the legendary record they compiled, never losing a bomber to enemy fighters on escort missions they led, a claim that has been refined by historians but remains substantially accurate, was not accident or exaggeration. It was the result of conscious tactical choice and relentless discipline. The bomber crews noticed. Word spread through the air bases in Italy. The red-tailed fighters became requested escorts. Pilots who had initially objected to flying with black escorts began specifically asking for the 332nd Fighter Group. The calculus was simple and brutal. Prejudice was a luxury, and survival was not. When your life depends on the skill of your escort, ideology becomes secondary to competence. The B-17 crews didn't need lectures about equality. They needed to get home, and the red tails brought them home. The symbolic object that recurs through this story is the aircraft itself. The P-51 Mustang was more than machinery. It was a physical manifestation of American industrial capacity, technological innovation, and democratic access to opportunity. The Luftwaffe flew excellent fighters, the Bf-109, the FW-190. But German industry was crumbling under Allied bombing. Fuel was scarce. Replacement parts were harder to find, and training programs had been gutted to feed the Eastern Front's insatiable demand for pilots. German aviators flew with increasing desperation, knowing that each mission might be their last not because of enemy action, but because their own infrastructure was collapsing. The Mustang represented the opposite reality. American factories were producing them by the thousands. Fuel was abundant. Replacement aircraft arrived continuously. If a Tuskegee pilot returned from a mission with a damaged fighter, it would be repaired or replaced within days. The material disparity was psychological warfare. Every encounter reinforced the same message. America had resources to spare, could afford to produce excellence in overwhelming quantity, and was willing to entrust that excellence to men whom the enemy considered inherently inferior. The red paint on those tails was American abundance made visible. Paint seemed frivolous in a war economy, but the United States could afford the frivolity because it had already met every material need. The color was chosen for identification, but it became a symbol of something larger, the ability to personalize, to add flourish, to make a statement beyond pure function. Axis pilots flew aircraft in utilitarian schemes, camouflage greens and grays designed for survival. The red tails announced presence. They said, "We are here, we want you to see us, we are not hiding." The transformation this story marks is ideological collapse. For German and Japanese pilots who encountered the Tuskegee Airmen, the experience functioned as a kind of involuntary education. They had been taught that warfare revealed natural hierarchies, that combat was a Darwinian test that would validate racial theories. Instead, combat revealed that those theories were lies. The black pilots in red-tailed Mustangs flew with skill that proved human capability was not constrained by melanin. The American military, for all its deep and ongoing racism, had still created pathways, narrow, difficult, unfair pathways, for black Americans to demonstrate competence in the most demanding roles. The Axis powers had no equivalent. Nazi Germany used forced labor from occupied territories, but never seriously considered training non-Germans as combat pilots. Imperial Japan's conception of racial purity was even more rigid. The ideological commitment to hierarchy prevented them from accessing the full human resources of their empires, even as they faced manpower shortages. American racism was brutal and systematic, but it was not absolute. The cracks in it, the Tuskegee program, the eventual integration of combat units, created operational advantages that the Axis couldn't match. Franz Stigler survived the war. In later interviews, he spoke carefully about what he had experienced, what he had believed, what he came to understand. The encounter with the red-tailed Mustangs was one moment in a larger process of disillusionment, but it was a significant moment. Seeing a black pilot fly with excellence didn't immediately erase years of indoctrination, but it planted a seed of doubt that grew over time. After the war, after the camps were liberated and the full scope of Nazi atrocity became undeniable, men like Stigler had to reconcile what they had believed with what they had done, what they had supported, what they had been complicit in. The Tuskegee Airmen returned home to a country that still enforced segregation, that still denied them basic civil rights, that still treated them as second-class citizens despite their combat records. They had proven their competence beyond any reasonable doubt, and it changed almost nothing immediately. But they had created a factual record that could not be erased. They had demonstrated that the justifications for segregation were lies. And they had done it in the most visible, dramatic, undeniable way possible. By outperforming expectations in combat, by protecting white bomber crews who owed them their lives, by succeeding in circumstances designed to ensure their failure. The epilogue to this story is written in the sky over Berlin, and in 1,000 smaller moments. It is written in the mission logs that record sortie after sortie, escort after escort, bombers protected and brought home. It is written in the kill claims validated by gun camera footage, in the recommendations for distinguished flying crosses and silver stars, in the simple statistical fact that this unit performed as well as or better than any other fighter group in the theater. It is written in the memories of bomber crews who saw red tails and felt safer, who came home to their families because those fighters stayed close, who had to confront their own prejudices because their lives had depended on men they had been taught to consider inferior. The larger truth this experience reveals is uncomfortable for everyone. It indicts Nazi racial ideology as the murderous fraud it always was, but it also indicts American racism for creating circumstances where black pilots had to be exceptional just to be considered adequate, where their service in defense of a country that oppressed them required courage beyond what was asked of their white counterparts. The Tuskegee Airmen were fighting two wars simultaneously, one against Axis forces in Europe, one against systemic racism at home. They won tactical victories in the first war and strategic victories in the second, though those strategic victories took decades to fully materialize. For the German and Japanese pilots who encountered them, the red-tailed Mustangs represented an epistemological crisis. The pilots were evidence that everything they had been taught about race and capability was wrong. And if that foundation was wrong, what else had they been lied to about? What other justifications for war and conquest and atrocity were built on similar falsehoods? The questions were dangerous, the implications devastating. Most preferred not to think about it too deeply. But the questions persisted, planted by that moment of recognition when a black pilot in a red-tailed Mustang outflew, outfought, and outlasted them. The American democratic experiment is defined by its contradictions. The same nation that wrote, "All men are created equal," enslaved millions. The same military that fought fascism enforced racial segregation. The Tuskegee Airmen existed in that contradiction, and their achievement was forcing America to confront it. They used the machinery of war, the P-51 Mustang, the strategic bombing campaign, the desperate circumstances of total conflict to demonstrate a truth that should have been self-evident but required proof written in combat records and mission reports. The abundance they represented was not merely material. Yes, the factories producing unlimited aircraft mattered. Yes, the fuel and ammunition mattered. But the deeper abundance was philosophical. The idea, however imperfectly realized, that talent and capability are distributed across all humanity, that denying access on the basis of race is not just morally wrong but operationally stupid, that a society that creates pathways for all its people to contribute is stronger than a society that artificially restricts participation to a supposed master class. Nazi Germany strangled itself with racial ideology. It murdered millions who could have contributed to its society. It fought a war on multiple fronts against enemies whose industrial and human resources it had systematically underestimated. It collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Imperial Japan followed a similar trajectory, its conception of racial purity and divine destiny leading it into conflicts it could not win, against enemies it did not understand. The United States won not because it was racially enlightened. It was not. But because its contradictions were less absolute, its ideology more flexible, its systems capable of change even when that change came slowly and painfully. The Tuskegee Airmen were products of those contradictions, and they were agents of change within them. Every mission they flew was an argument for equality. Every bomber they brought home was evidence for their case. The sky belongs to whoever can master it. This is the final truth that the red-tailed Mustangs taught to everyone who saw them. Not to white bomber crews who learned to trust their black escorts. Not to German pilots who had to abandon racial theories when they conflicted with survival. Not to American commanders who discovered that talent exists everywhere if you create systems to develop it. The sky is indifferent to ideology. It responds only to skill, courage, preparation, and luck. The forces of lift and drag, thrust and weight operate the same for everyone. The physics of aerial combat don't care about the race of the pilot. Human systems care about race. Human systems create barriers and hierarchies, justifications and mythologies. But the sky itself is democratic in a way that human societies struggle to achieve. It will kill anyone who lacks skill, and it will carry anyone who has it. The Tuskegee Airmen understood this. They mastered the objective requirements of flight and combat, and then they used that mastery to challenge the subjective requirements of a racist society. When Franz Stigler saw that black pilot in the red-tailed Mustang, he was seeing a truth his ideology had tried to hide from him. Competence is not racial, courage is not genetic, excellence is not the property of any master race. He was seeing the future, though he probably didn't recognize it in that moment. The future where the lies of racial hierarchy would be exposed, where the evidence of human equality would become too overwhelming to deny, where the cost of maintaining false beliefs would become too high. The red tails flew through the winter sky over Berlin, escorts for bombers carrying destruction to the heart of the Reich. They flew with the confidence of men who knew their capabilities, who had proven themselves beyond reasonable doubt, who carried the hopes of millions on their wings. They flew missions that should have been routine but were extraordinary because of who was flying them. They flew into history, and their contrails wrote messages in the sky that no ideology could erase. Democracy, for all its failures and hypocrisies, contains within itself the mechanism for self-correction. The Tuskegee Airmen were part of that mechanism. They forced America to look at itself, to see the gap between its stated ideals and its lived reality to begin, however slowly, closing that gap. The red-tailed Mustangs were not just weapons of war. They were arguments made visible, flying at 300 miles per hour, armed with evidence that could not be refuted. The German pilots who survived those encounters carried the memory forward. Some never spoke of it. Some dismissed it as an aberration. But some, like Stigler, let it become part of a larger reckoning with what they had believed and what they had done in service of those beliefs. The dissonance created by seeing a black pilot outfly them was a crack in the wall, and through that crack came light, and with that light came the slow, painful process of understanding how thoroughly they had been deceived. The epilogue is unfinished. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen continues in the ongoing struggle for equality, in the battles fought not with P-51 Mustangs, but with legislation and protest, education and representation. Their combat record became evidence in the fight to integrate the American military, which became a model for broader social integration. The Red Tails flew in the 1940s, but their legacy extends through decades, through the civil rights movement and beyond, a proof of concept that remains relevant whenever someone claims that any group is inherently inferior. For the German and Japanese pilots who faced them, The experience was a moment of involuntary truth in the midst of a war built on lies. They had expected to face inferior opponents, had believed the propaganda that told them they were naturally superior warriors, had convinced themselves that their causes were just and their victories inevitable. The red-tailed Mustangs disrupted all of it. They were evidence that could not be rationalized away, performance that could not be attributed to luck or circumstance, competence that demanded recognition even from those whose ideology required its denial. In the end, the sky over Europe in 1945 became a classroom where lessons were taught at 400 miles per hour, where the curriculum was survival, and where the teachers wore red-tailed Mustangs like academic regalia. The students who lived remembered. The students who died took their lessons to whatever comes after, and the world slowly, imperfectly, began to learn what the Tuskegee Airmen had always known: that the boundaries humans draw to separate themselves from each other are illusions, that capability and courage are universal human traits, and that any society that denies this does so at its own peril. The red tails fly still, in memory and symbol, in the historical record and in the imagination. They fly as reminders of what was proven, what was sacrificed, what was achieved against impossible odds. They fly as warnings against the ideologies that deny human equality, as evidence for the cases still being argued, as inspiration for the battles still being fought. They are painted bright red so no one can claim they didn't see them, so no one can pretend they didn't matter, so no one can forget what they represented. Democracy's promise, made visible in the winter sky, armed and dangerous and undeniable.